Hey folks, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to start a new journey on React Query. React Query is a new state management and its goal is to improve our developer experience and the user experience. You can find its implementation for React, Vue, Solid.js and Svelte. But I don't want to spend too much time to introduce the library and I want to show you its feature. So don't waste time and let's jump in it. The application is a simple to-do app. That is a simple React application where you can find an input where you can insert new task, for instance, or you can edit some task and delete, assign, do the login and so on. All the application doesn't have an implementation in this moment, and the goal of this content is to implement the business logic of this simple application using React Query. So in this way you can understand the feature and the benefit of using React Query in your application. First of all, we have to install our library in the project. So we can open a new terminal and type npm install at stack/react query. And after some seconds, we have our library ready to use. Now, to use our library, we have to import a provider. The provider is called Query Client Provider, and we can import it from the library. So provider, Query Client Provider. We can wrap the application with this provider. Perfect. But this provider needs a property called client. This client is used by React Query to fetch requests, and so you can get the data from the API or send data to your API. You can find the client in the library, so we can find query client and we can initialize it in this way. So const query client equals to new query client, and we can pass it to the client in the provider. In this way, we have configured our React Query application, and we can start to use it in our component. A common tips is to create a new folder called React Query and create a file called client.ts, and inside of this file put the query client. So we can get our query client and move it to the client.ts file, export it and import the query client class. Now we can import the query client from the React Query /client, and we can use it in our application. Perfect. Okay, now it's time to get our first data from an API. To do that using React Query, we have to use a useQuery hooks. This hooks is used to retrieve data from an API or a GraphQL, and under the hood, this hooks does a lot of stuff for us, but we'll see all this stuff later. Okay, to use React Query, we have to import the useQuery hook. So from stack query, we can use query. Then in our hooks, we can use it. So const and use query. The first argument is an array. This array is the key for our query. For instance, in this case, to do. And the second argument is the method used to get data from the API or something else. Now we can get the result of this these hooks, and in this case we can use the data contain the result of the query. In this case the result is a list of to do or undefined, so we can rename data using to do's, and we can return to do's. As you can notice, there is a problem because to do could be also undefined, but in my signature to do's is an array of to do. To fix it, we can set the default value as an empty array. Okay, now it's time to integrate our hooks in our components. So in the list folder there is a index.tsx file, and inside of it we can remove the list state and replace it with our hooks. So we can use to-dos, and we can get the to-dos and rename it with a list, so we don't have any problem with the name. Now we can go to our browser and check the result. So as you can notice, if I refresh the page, the page fetch a request to the API/task URL and get the result from this API. The API is built using JSON server, so if I go to my fake database and change the task text, as you can notice, my application get the new data when I focus again the windows. Okay, another cool feature exposed by useQuery is that each time you get the focus in the page, useQuery try to get fresh data for your UI. So for instance, if I click in the developer tool and then I click again in the page, as you can notice there is an HTTP request. Then again, if I click in the developer tool and then in the page, the useQuery hook try to get a fresh data for our application. This option is enabled by default, but you can disable it if you want from the option in the useQuery hooks. To disable this option, we can go in our use to do hooks, and the third parameter in the useQuery is an option parameter, and you can find the on Windows focus, refetch on Windows focus, and we can put it to false, for instance. Then if you go back to the browser and for instance I click in the developer tool and then I click again in the page, as you can notice the application doesn't refetch the data. So in this case you can decide if you want or if you not want fresh data for your application when the user get the focus again in your page. Another info exposed by useQuery is the isLoading state. So we can use the isLoading and export it. IsLoading, and we can add it loading boolean. Now we can use it in our component to indicate the loading status, for instance. So we can go in the component and add and is loading with the capital L, and perfect. Okay, to check the result we can go back to our browser, and if I go back to the home page, as you can notice now the application loaded the JavaScript for the component, and then when all is okay, now we have the loading text that indicate the component load the the task from the API. Okay, another cool feature exposed by useQuery is the error message. So we can get the error from our hooks, and we can map it in another error. For instance, in our case, error is string, and it's optional. So now we can return our error in this way. So we can use error, and we can use our map error function with the error. So if the error is undefined, return undefined. If the error is an instance of response error, return the status text. Otherwise, if is of kind error, return the error.message. In the other case, return unknown error, for instance. Then we can use this error in our component. So we can go back in our list and get the error, for instance. In this case, we can go in our component, and if error, we can show a div with, for instance, style, color, red, and inside of this div we can print the error. Then we can stop the API and go back to the browser. Okay, if I refresh the page, as you can notice, useQuery try to fetch the data, and after a while show an error, probably. Yes, internal server error. If I open my developer tool and I go to the network and I refresh the page, as you can notice, useQuery try to fetch the data 1 time, 2 time, 3 time, 4 time, and then show the error. As you can imagine, useQuery by default retry 4 times if there is an error in the API. After the fourth error, he returned the error in this case. To edit the retry property, we have to go to our useQuery hooks, and in the option we can pass the retry property. So we can pass 0 if we don't want the retry. Otherwise, we can pass, for instance, 2 if you want the code retry twice. In this case, we can go back to our browser and clear the console and refresh the page. In this case, as you can notice, one request, then retry for the first time, another error, and retry for the second times, and after the third error, the useQuery show the error message. All this kind of property could be set at global if you want, but we can go dive on them in another video. There is another cool feature exposed by useQuery, and its name is fetching. What is fetching? We can say to useQuery to refresh the data after some times. For instance, we can pass a property called refresh interval, and we can pass, for instance, 1 second in this case. We can now export our is fetching, so we can use is fetching and return it, and we can use it in our component. So is fetching, and we can use is fetching, and we can use fetching without the is loading. Perfect. Now we can check the result in the browser. Okay, I refresh the page, and as you can notice, now each second the application tries to refresh the data from the API, and the application shows the fetching loader to indicate to the user that it's tried to refresh the data. This is very common to use when we have an infinity scroll and we have to keep the previous result and indicate to the user that we are doing a new request to forget the new data. Okay, from the useQuery hook, it's all. Now you have all the fundamental to start to work with it and to use it in your application. In the next content, we'll face up with the use mutation hook and we learn how we can use it to save data in our API. I hope you enjoy this content, and if you like it, please hit the like button below, and if you want to stay updated with my content, please subscribe to my channel. So thank you and see you soon. Bye bye!